Welcome.
Welcome to the Everything Podcast, and in this episode I'll be recapping the Grand Tour Season 1 Episode 2 titled Operation Desert Stumble, which was originally released on the 25th of November 2016, and I'm recording this episode nearly 9 years later on the 18th of August 2025. But before I recap this episode, a couple of things. Please go and check out my recap of the Grand Tour Season 1 Episode 1, which you can find in a few ways. Click on the channel page, go into playlist, should be near the top, or if you wait till the episode, the end of the episode, it should appear then. But before my recap, here is the trailer for the Grand Tour Season 1.
Is your door broken?
No, I'm broken. Can you hold the door for me?
Have you
Both
seriously
of you.
broken your arm?
Well, it's fractured.
Which arm have you broken?
Is there an event on? Is it always this busy?
Wow, Roger Moore isn't here.
Looking good is more important than looking where you're going.
That's when you're going to do that, eh?
This could be so expensive.
We're going on a road trip in very exotic cars.
Grand touring.
Come on, how does it look to him?
That's to release it, you muppet!
We've only had one minor fire. It's like that Tom Cruise movie.
Cocktail.
What's this, sunshine? It's quite normal.
That was the trailer for the Grand Tour Season 1, and now is my recap for the Grand Tour Season 1 Episode 2 titled Operation Desert Stumble. We start off with the Grand Tour title sequence. Jeremy, James and Richard enter the tent. Jeremy introduces this episode. Highlights from this episode are shown, which includes Jeremy driving a car, James driving a lorry and Richard fighting someone. Jeremy mentions South Africa, Johannesburg and the cradle of mankind. James and Richard insult Jeremy. Jeremy quotes Jacob Zuma. Jeremy mentions arithmetic. A clip featuring Jacob Zuma is shown. Richard and James showcase some of Jacob Zuma's castles. A lot of S's there. Jeremy mentions South African wildlife. Jeremy showcases a mislabeled sign. Jeremy mentions England. A photo showing a baboon wielding something is shown. Jeremy insults the South African police, accompanied with a photo of why he believes this is the case. Richard mentions Aston Martin and James Bond. Jeremy mentions racing cars. James mentions road cars. Jeremy introduces the Aston Martin Vulcan, which costs £1.8 million. Jeremy insults the practicality of the Aston Martin Vulcan. Jeremy struggles to get in the Aston Martin Vulcan. Jeremy mentions his weight and the Aston Martin Vulcan's engine. Jeremy drives the Aston Martin Vulcan. Jeremy insults the Aston Martin Vulcan and the radio mic he's currently wearing. Jeremy mentions the brakes in the Aston Martin Vulcan. Jeremy compares these brakes to piglets. Jeremy compares the Aston Martin Vulcan to bears. Jeremy insults the Aston Martin Vulcan steering wheel. Jeremy reveals what is included in the price of the Aston Martin Vulcan. Jeremy mentions driving. Where am I up to? Oh no, I've missed lines. That's why I got confused. Jeremy drives the Aston Martin Vulcan on full power. Jeremy forgets to stop the Aston Martin Vulcan. Jeremy mentions driving the Aston Martin for at least 3 hours. Jeremy mentions the McLaren P1. Jeremy admits to loving the Aston Martin Vulcan. Jeremy mentions the past or the future. Jeremy compliments the Aston Martin Vulcan. Jeremy mentions Shepherd's Pie. Richard lists some cars cheaper than the Aston Martin Vulcan. The American drives the Aston Martin Vulcan around the Ebola drome. The American mentions NASCAR and Deere, as well as James Bond and Vin Diesel. The Aston Martin Vulcan's lap time is 1:15.5. Richard introduces Conversation Street. Jeremy mentions the 001. Jeremy mentions this car having a horsepower per kilogram. Jeremy insults downforce. Jeremy mentions invisible elephants. Jeremy and James propose hypothetical situations. This annoys Richard. James mentions the weather. Jeremy mentions Holland and Johannesburg, as well as elephants in North Korea. Richard mentions a medical tablet. Jeremy introduces the Bugatti Chiron. Richard delivers a disclaimer around the Bugatti Chiron. Jeremy reveals some statistics about the Bugatti Chiron and the people currently buying Bugatti Chiron. James mentions South Africa and carjackings. Richard and James mention the studio audience. James reads out a list of cars. Richard points out that these cars are the most popular cars in South Africa. James mentions a car. Richard believes this is James's dream car. James further proves this point about his dream car. Richard and James mention the dentist. Richard mentions barbers and doctors. Jeremy mentions insanity in South Africa. A photo is shown featuring a python in a car. Jeremy compares pythons and burglar alarms. Richard compares snakes to dogs. Jeremy insults Bike Mine. A video featuring Bike Mine is shown. James mentions vases. Jeremy mentions Jordan in a Special Forces competition. James mentions Mr. Woolman whilst insulting him and explaining who he is. Jeremy mentions shooting in the SAS. Jeremy and Richard insult James's driving. Jeremy introduces the film set in Jordan featuring him, James and Richard. Jeremy introduces the Special Forces based in Amman. Some Special Forces soldiers demonstrate what Jeremy, James and Richard are attempting to achieve. Richard corrects Jeremy shoots a car whilst injuring himself. Jeremy, James and Richard insult themselves. Jeremy, James and Richard get changed. Richard reveals he is wearing snow camouflage. Jeremy informs Richard that it has never snowed in Jordan. James reads out a message from Mr. Woman. Jeremy and Richard name multiple Tom Cruise films. Jeremy, James and Richard attempt what the Special Forces soldiers achieve successfully. Jeremy reveals his plan. Jeremy admits to never climbing rope. James admits to being scared of height. Jeremy mentions 30 feet. James and Richard believe you can die falling 30 feet. Jeremy attempts to get down the helicopter. Richard considers tickling Jeremy. I just remembered it because it's been a few days since I wrote that section of the recap, and obviously watched the episode to write the recap. Jeremy notices that his trousers have fallen down. Jeremy is blown up. Jeremy attempts to convince James to get out of the helicopter. James proposes that they land the helicopter. Richard agrees with this. The helicopter lands. Jeremy has to wear glasses to read. Jeremy, James and Richard discover that the grenade Jeremy threw him was a smoke grenade. Jeremy and Richard convince James to kick a door in. James notices a window. James and Richard get out of a window. Jeremy gets stuck attempting to get out through the window. Jeremy updates Richard. Jeremy asks James to repeatedly kill him. Problem when there's two characters with similar names. James is repeatedly unable to shoot Jeremy. James insults machine guns. Jeremy convinces Richard to knock him out. Jeremy, James and Richard have to restart their mission. Jeremy asks James to steal a car to remind us that the Grand Tour is a car show. Jeremy insults James to Richard. James is shot. Jeremy, James and Richard have to restart their mission again. James is shot repeatedly. James believes the sniper will eventually miss. Jeremy and Richard eat and drink. James notices some vehicles. Richard reveals their new plan. Jeremy quotes a film. Jeremy shoots someone. Jeremy celebrates this. Richard informs Jeremy that James has electrocuted himself. Richard corrects James about finding car keys. Jeremy insults Audi. Jeremy, James and Richard drive vehicles. The second half of this will be shown later on in this episode. Jeremy reveals why he's his trousers fall down. Richard mocks Jeremy. James mentions South Africa. James, Richard and Jeremy showcase some homemade cars. Jeremy introduces Yeoman. Jeremy questions Yeoman. Yeoman reveals his car is road legal. Yeoman mentions his wife. Jeremy compliments Yeoman. Jeremy and Richard introduce making James May doing something that he doesn't want to do. Richard explains what spinning is. Jeremy insults James. James introduces the Wheels and Smoke Arena. James reveals what he believes spinning is. James introduces Stacey. James compliments Stacey. James participates in spinning. James admits to not liking the smell of tyre smoke. James swears at someone. James thanks this person. James reveals how many miles his last pair of tyres lasted. Jeremy mentions England and Australia. James admits to not liking spinning. Jeremy introduces Celebrity Brain Crash. Jeremy mentions the events of last episode's Celebrity Brain Crash segment, which went disastrously wrong, if you watch that recap or the episode itself. Jeremy introduces a celebrity. This celebrity gets attacked by a lion. James and Richard discuss this celebrity. Jeremy mentions prison. James recaps the Jordan film. Part 2 of the Jordan film is shown. Jeremy, James and Richard continue their mission. Jeremy reveals their new plan. James does something that makes a lot of noise. Jeremy mentions the terrorist. This part of the mission has to be restarted. Jeremy attempts to cause a distraction. Jeremy insults the car he is currently driving. Richard and James get into the plane. Jeremy attempts to help James and Richard. Jeremy updates James and Richard on the VIP. James reveals his feelings on the royal family. Jeremy compliments himself, James and Richard. Jeremy confronts James over shooting Richard. Jeremy, James and Richard restart their mission multiple times. Richard admits to shooting James. Richard has a knife fight with someone. Richard is stabbed. Jeremy repeats himself to the Queen. Jeremy, James and Richard attempt to protect the Queen. Jeremy reveals that James has just shot the Queen. James shoots Richard to restart their attempt. Jeremy disarms James. Jeremy, James and Richard as well as the Queen are currently being shot at. The Queen seems to find Jeremy rather interesting. James helps Jeremy review a car. Richard doesn't appreciate this. Richard shoots at the terrorists. Jeremy lists multiple films. Richard asks Jeremy to be quiet. Jeremy gives some advice about driving cars. Jeremy mentions Nicolas Cage. James causes a car to explode. James corrects Jeremy. Jeremy agrees to cover James and Richard. Jeremy shoots multiple people. Richard convinces Jeremy to keep running. James and the Queen discuss the royal family. Richard mentions the mines. Jeremy manages to get over the finish line. Richard convinces Jeremy to do this. Jeremy, James and Richard have completed their mission. Jeremy reveals his James and Richard's attempt took 9 hours and 48 minutes. Jeremy reveals how many times he was shot during the last leg of his James and Richard's attempt. And Jeremy and Richard conclude the episode, and that is my recap of the Grand Tour Season 1, Episode 2, titled Operation Desert Stumble. Let me know what you thought of the Grand Tour Season 1, Episode 2, titled Operation Desert Stumble if you watched it. My recap, if you give me thoughts on both of those in the comments below. As well, anything else you want to the channel, such as any previews or recaps, put those in the comments below as well. Remember, you can also like, comment and subscribe. And just a reminder, there is an audio only version of the podcast of this episode and all the episodes. So if you go, all of the episodes recently at least, because it would have taken me a year to put them all on there, but recently you can find them if you go to the podcast's X page, which is X with the Everything Podcast, and there'll be links to there and you can find them quite easily, but if you like the video episodes, please keep watching them, as Matt spends a lot of time per episode. I'm astonished at how much time, when he told me, first of all, how long it took. That's when he's an animator, I suppose. Just another reminder that the 2 podcast episodes a day, as you're probably more than aware by now, with the first episode releasing at 11 AM GMT and the second episode released at 3 PM GMT. Without further ado, I will see you in a future episode of the podcast. See you then. Goodbye.